At my daughter's wedding, a janitor grabbed my arm and whispered, "If you value your safety, Hyde, please trust me." I almost brushed her off until I saw the fear in her eyes. "Follow me," she said quietly. She led me to a hidden corner behind the reception hall. Exactly 10 minutes later, what I overheard from the conversation inside made my hands go numb. In that moment, I understood something terrifying. This wedding wasn't about love. It was about setting a trap. Thank you so much for being here with me. Before we continue, take a moment to leave a comment and tell me, where are you watching from and what time is it where you are right now. Your presence and perspective truly matter. And just a quick note, some parts of this story are fictional, created for storytelling and reflection, with details adjusted to highlight the lessons it carries. I woke up that Saturday morning the way I'd woken up for the last 5 years, alone, in a bed built for two. The sunlight filtered through the curtains of the Mitchell Estate master bedroom, painting soft gold across the empty pillow beside me. Penelope's pillow. I used to reach for her in those first drowsy seconds before memory caught up with me. Now I just lay there and let the silence settle in. 5 years. 5 years since I'd lost her, and I still hadn't figured out how to fill the space she left behind. But today wasn't about loss. Today was about Lydia. I pushed myself up and walked to the window. The estate grounds stretched out below me, manicured lawns, white tent canopies already in place for the reception chairs lined up in perfect rows. Everything ready, everything perfect. She would have loved this, I thought. Penelope would have been up since dawn, directing every detail, crying happy tears into her coffee. She would have made sure Lydia knew she was beautiful. She would have held our daughter's hand through the nerves and the joy and everything in between. Instead, it was just me. I made myself a promise, standing there at that window, I'll protect her the way you would have wanted me to. I didn't know then how much that promise would cost. By 10 o'clock, the house was alive with motion. Lydia's bridesmaids filled the east wing with laughter and champagne. I could hear them from downstairs, high, bright voices that reminded me Lydia wasn't a little girl anymore. She was 29, a woman, about to become someone's wife, Danny Sullivan's wife. I pushed the thought aside and headed upstairs. When I knocked on her door, the laughter quieted. "Come in, Dad." I stepped inside and the world stopped. Lydia stood in front of the full-length mirror in her wedding dress, a cascade of ivory lace and silk that caught the morning light like water. Her hair was swept up, delicate and elegant, and when she turned to look at me, her eyes were bright with tears she was trying not to shed. "Dad," she whispered, "what do you think?" I couldn't speak for a moment. All I could see was the little girl who used to stand on my shoes while we danced in the living room, the teenager who'd cried on my shoulder after her first heartbreak, the young woman who'd called me from college just to hear my voice, and now this. "You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," I finally said. "Your mother would be so proud." She crossed the room and hugged me tight. I held her like I used to when she was small, wishing I could freeze this moment forever. "I love you, Dad," she said softly. "I love you too, sweetheart." I kissed the top of her head and stepped back before the tears could come. "Let's get you married." St. Mary's Cathedral was everything Lydia had dreamed of. Soaring ceilings, stained glass windows, throwing colored light across the pews, 200 guests dressed in their finest. The organ swelled as we walked down the aisle together, and I felt every eye in the room on us. But I only saw Danny. He stood at the altar in a sharp black tuxedo, hands clasped in front of him, watching Lydia with what looked like complete adoration. Handsome, polished, successful, everything a father could want for his daughter. So why did I feel that small, nagging tug of unease? "Stop it," I told myself. "You're just nervous. Every father feels this way." We reached the altar. Father Christopher Bennett smiled warmly. "Who gives this woman to be married to this man?" I looked at Lydia one last time. She was glowing. "I do," I said. I placed her hand in Danny's, stepped back, and watched my daughter become someone else's responsibility. The ceremony blurred after that. Vows, rings, the kiss, applause. I clapped along with everyone else, smiling the way I was supposed to, feeling the strange mix of pride and loss that comes with letting go. The reception at the waterfront venue was perfect. String lights hung from the ceiling like stars. The tables were dressed in white linen and gold accents. A live band played soft jazz as guests filled the space with laughter and conversation. Lydia and Danny moved through the crowd like they'd been doing this their whole lives, shaking hands, accepting congratulations, looking every bit the golden couple. I watched them take the floor for their first dance. The band shifted into a slow melody, and Danny pulled Lydia close. She rested her head on his shoulder, and he whispered something that made her laugh. The room watched in silence, captivated. I felt something loosen in my chest. Maybe I was wrong, I thought. Maybe everything really is going to be okay. James Cooper appeared at my side with 2 glasses of bourbon. "She looks happy," he said, handing me one. "She does. You did good, Mark." I nodded, but I didn't answer. That small tug of unease was still there, quiet but persistent, like a stone in my shoe. I couldn't shake. James clinked his glass against mine. To Lydia. We drank in silence, and I tried to let the moment be enough. An hour later, I found myself on the venue's rooftop terrace. I needed air. I needed space. I needed to stop overthinking every look Danny gave my daughter and every word he spoke. "You're being paranoid," I told myself. The city lights stretched out below me, quiet and distant. I leaned against the railing and closed my eyes. "Mr. Mitchell." I turned. A woman stood a few feet away, middle-aged, wearing the venue's cleaning staff uniform, holding a spray bottle and a rag. I recognized her vaguely from earlier in the evening. She'd been clearing tables, moving quietly through the crowd, like a ghost. "Can I help you?" I asked. She glanced over her shoulder, then stepped closer. "Mr. Mitchell," she said again, her voice low and urgent. "I need you to trust me. Right now." I frowned. "What's this about?" She looked at me with eyes that were steady and serious. "It's about your daughter and the man she just married." My stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" "I don't have much time," she said quickly. "But I overheard something tonight. Something you need to know." I stared at her, my heart starting to pound. "Who are you?" "My name is Diana Foster," she said. "And if you care about your daughter, you'll listen to me." Before I could ask another question, Diana grabbed my arm. "We don't have time," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "Come with me, now." "Wait, what's going on?" "Please, Mr. Mitchell." Her grip tightened. "If you want to understand, you need to trust me." Something in her eyes made me follow. She led me quickly through the rooftop door and down a back stairwell I hadn't even known existed. The music from the reception grew fainter as we descended, replaced by the hum of industrial air conditioning and the distant clatter of kitchen staff. We emerged into a service corridor lined with storage closets and supply racks. Diana pulled me into a narrow room filled with cleaning supplies and stacked chairs. The door clicked shut behind us. The space was dim, lit only by a sliver of light from the hallway outside. "Stay quiet," she whispered. "Don't make a sound." My heart was pounding. "What the hell is this about?" "Just wait." She moved to the door and cracked it open, peering through the gap. I stood frozen behind her, my mind racing. Was this some kind of prank, a mistake? Was I really hiding in a storage closet at my daughter's wedding reception? And then I heard voices in the hallway. "I can't believe you pulled that off." A woman's voice. Young, familiar. "Vanessa." My blood went cold. Lydia's maid of honor. My niece. Vanessa, my own brother's daughter, who'd stood beside Lydia at the altar like family should. "It wasn't that hard." A man replied, his tone smooth and confident. "Danny." The world tilted. Diana glanced back at me, her expression grave. She pressed a finger to her lips. I stayed silent, but my hands were shaking. Through the crack in the door, I could see them now, Danny and Vanessa, standing in the hallway just a few feet away. Close enough that I could see the way Danny's hand rested on Vanessa's waist. Close enough to see the way she leaned into him. It wasn't familial. It wasn't innocent. It was intimate. My niece. My brother's daughter. The girl I'd watched grow up alongside Lydia. The girl who used to call me Uncle Mark and ask me to push her on the swings. Now she was standing in a dimly lit hallway with my daughter's husband, and everything about the way they were touching made my stomach turn. "You sure about this?" Vanessa asked quietly. "Once this is done, it'll be fine," Danny cut her off. "We've been over this. I know, but it's a lot of money, Danny. $10 million in life insurance alone." The words hit me like a fist to the chest. $10 million. Life insurance. "Trust me," Danny said, his voice low and calm. "The old man doesn't suspect a thing. He's too busy playing the proud father. And once everything's in place, what about Lydia?" There was a pause. A long, heavy pause that made my chest tighten. "She's useful," Danny finally said. "For now." Vanessa laughed softly, but there was no warmth in it. "You're terrible. I'm practical. And when she's not useful anymore, then we'll deal with it." They moved closer together, and I saw Danny press a kiss to Vanessa's forehead, tender, practiced, like they'd done this 1,000 times before. Like she wasn't my niece, like Lydia wasn't her cousin. "Relax," he murmured. "Everything's going according to plan. 6 months, maybe less. Then we're set. Promise. Promise." Vanessa pulled back, smoothing her bridesmaid dress, the same dress Lydia had helped her pick out 3 months ago. The same dress she'd been so excited about. "Oh, I should get back before someone notices," she said. "Go ahead, I'll follow in a minute." She kissed him once more, quick and deliberate, and then disappeared down the hallway, her heels clicking against the tile. Danny stood there for a moment, adjusting his tie in the reflection of a decorative mirror on the wall. He smiled at himself, the same charming smile he'd given my daughter at the altar. Then he turned and walked away, whistling softly. I didn't move. I couldn't. Diana slowly closed the door and turned to face me in the dim light. "Now do you believe me?" she whispered. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. My mind was spinning, trying to process what I'd just heard. $10 million in life insurance. She's useful, for now. 6 months, maybe less. And Vanessa, my brother's daughter. Family. Mr. Mitchell. Diana's voice cut through the fog. "Are you okay?" No, I said hoarsely. "No, I'm not okay." She stepped closer. "I'm sorry you had to hear that. But you needed to know." "How long?" I stopped trying to steady my voice. "How long have you known?" "I've worked here for 10 years," Diana said quietly. "You see a lot when people don't notice you. I've been watching them all night. The way he looks at her when no one's paying attention. The way they disappear at the same time. I've seen this before, Mr. Mitchell. Men like him. They're predators." I leaned against the wall, my legs suddenly unsteady. "Vanessa," I whispered. "She's my niece, my brother's kid. I used to take her to baseball games. I taught her how to ride a bike. I know. She was at our house every weekend when she was little. She and Lydia were inseparable. They were supposed to be like sisters." Diana was silent. "And now she's—" I couldn't finish the sentence. The betrayal was too big, too incomprehensible. "Ah, she's made her choice," Diana said gently. "A terrible one. But it's not your fault." "Lydia," I said, my voice breaking. "My daughter—" "She doesn't know," Diana said. "I'm sure of it. She wouldn't have asked Vanessa to be her maid of honor if she knew. She married him." The words tasted like ash. "She stood in front of 200 people and married him. And Vanessa stood right there beside her, smiling, holding her flowers, acting like—" I stopped, the weight of it crushing me. Diana reached into her pocket and pulled out a small card. She pressed it into my hand. "My number," she said. If you need anything, a witness, a statement, anything, you call me. I'll testify to what I saw. I stared at the card, my fingers trembling. Why are you doing this? I asked. You don't even know me? Diana's expression softened. Because I have a daughter too. And if someone knew she was in danger, I'd want them to tell me. I nodded slowly, slipping the card into my pocket. Thank you, I whispered. Don't thank me yet, she said. Just be careful. Men like Danny don't give up easily. And if your niece is involved, and I know, I said quietly, it means he's thought this through. Diana opened the door and checked the hallway. It was empty. Go back to the reception, she said. Act normal. Don't let him know you suspect anything. And then what? Then you figure out how to protect your daughter. She slipped out of the room, leaving me alone in the dark. I stood there for a long time, listening to the muffled sounds of the reception above me. The music, the laughter, the clinking of glasses. 10 minutes ago, I'd been celebrating my daughter's wedding. Now I was hiding in a storage closet trying to process the fact that my son-in-law had just discussed her usefulness, like she was a business asset. And my niece, my own brother's daughter, was helping him. I had no proof. No one would believe me. But I knew the truth. And somehow, I was going to have to find a way to save Lydia from the two people who were supposed to love her most. Diana's hand on my shoulder brought me back. We need to get you out of here, she said softly. She led me through the service corridor to a side exit. The night air hit me like cold water. I leaned against the brick wall, gasping. Take a minute, she said. I couldn't. My mind kept replaying it. Danny's hand on Vanessa's waist, the casual way he'd called Lydia useful, my niece kissing him like it meant nothing. Mr. Mitchell, listen, Diana said firmly. That man is dangerous. I've worked venues for 10 years. I know a predator when I see one. I need to go to the police. With what? She asked gently. You overheard a conversation. No recording, no evidence, just your word against theirs. Then what do I do? Get proof, she said. And until you do, act normal. Don't let him know you suspect anything. She pressed her card into my hand again. If you need a witness, call me. But right now you go back in there and pretend everything's fine. I don't know if I can. You have to, Diana said. For your daughter. She was right. I straightened my jacket and nodded. I slipped back into the reception through a side entrance. The band was still playing. Nothing had changed, except everything had. Mark. Danny was walking toward me, smiling. There you are. You okay? You look pale. I forced myself to meet his eyes. Just emotional. You know how it is. He laughed and clapped my shoulder. I get it. Big day. She's lucky to have you, I said. I'm the lucky one, Danny replied smoothly. Lydia's amazing, and you raised an incredible woman, Mark. He leaned in slightly. I want you to know I'm going to take care of her. Whatever she needs. Whatever you need. We're family now. The word family made my stomach turn knowing what Vanessa was to us. I'm glad to hear it. I did good, Danny said. Because I was hoping we could sit down next week and talk about some business opportunities. Succession planning. I have ideas that might interest you. Succession planning. Life insurance. $10 million. Sure, we can talk. Perfect. He squeezed my shoulder. Thanks for trusting me with her. He walked away. Mark. James appeared beside me with 2 glasses of bourbon. You look like you need this. I drank half in one swallow. James studied me. What's going on? Nothing. Don't give me that. I've known you 30 years. Something's wrong. I wanted to tell him. But Diana's words echoed. Don't let him know you suspect anything. Just a long day, I said. James didn't look convinced, but he didn't push. If you need to talk, I know, thanks. He stayed beside me, a quiet presence. An hour later, Lydia found me. She threw her arms around me, laughing. I've been looking everywhere. I hugged her tight, probably too tight. Sorry, sweetheart, just needed some air. Are you okay? You seem off. I'm fine, just overwhelmed. Happy overwhelmed. She smiled, eyes bright. Thank you, Dad, for everything. For walking me down the aisle. For this beautiful reception. For being you. My chest tightened. I love you, Lydia. I love you too. She hugged me again, and I memorized the moment, her weight in my arms, her perfume, her laughter. She's useful, for now. I wanted to tell her. Wanted to drag her away from this nightmare. But I couldn't. Not without proof. Be happy, I whispered. I am, she said. I really, really am. She kissed my cheek and disappeared back toward Danny. The reception ended just after 11. Guests filed out slowly. Lydia and Danny stood near the entrance, thanking everyone, looking perfect. I watched from a distance as they climbed into the hired car, a sleek black sedan with white ribbons and a "Just Married" sign. Lydia waved through the window, beaming. I waved back. The car pulled away, taillights disappearing. She was gone. I sat in my car in the parking lot for almost an hour after everyone left. The venue lights went dark. The staff packed up. The lot emptied until it was just me and the silence. My daughter had just driven off with a man who saw her as an obstacle worth $10 million. And my niece, my own brother's daughter, was helping him. I couldn't tell Lydia. Not without evidence. If I went to her now with nothing but an overheard conversation, she'd never believe me. She'd think I was paranoid, controlling, unable to let go. Danny would convince her I'd lost it. Vanessa would back him up. And I'd lose my daughter forever. No, I needed proof. Real, undeniable proof. The house was too quiet. I stood in the foyer of the Mitchell estate just after midnight, keys still in my hand, staring at nothing. The drive home was a blur, just headlights and highway lines, and Diana's warning echoing in my head. Men like Danny don't make mistakes. I dropped my keys on the entry table and walked upstairs. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Danny's hand on Vanessa's waist. Heard his voice, she's useful. For now. At 2 a.m, I gave up and went to my study. The room was lined with framed photos, decades of memories in glass and wood. I turned on the desk lamp and let my eyes wander. Lydia at 5, holding a fishing rod twice her size. Lydia at 12, grass-stained in her soccer uniform. Lydia at 18, graduation cap, crooked Penelope's arm around her shoulders. Penelope would have known. She always knew when something was wrong. She had instincts I could read people the way I read contracts. If she'd been at that wedding, she would have seen through Danny in minutes. But she wasn't here. And I'd missed every warning sign. I sat down and opened my laptop, the screen's glow harsh in the darkness. I started typing, trying to piece together what I'd been too blind to see. 2 years of red flags I'd ignored, because I'd wanted Lydia to be happy. Because I'd wanted to believe Danny was the perfect son-in-law. The questions about my business. The interest in estate planning. The casual inquiry about life insurance, just making sure Lydia's taken care of, and my foolish answer, $10 million. The smile on his face when I'd told him. The fast engagement. My moment of doubt that I'd brushed aside. His meeting with Henry Wallace 6 months ago, wanting to understand California estate law. I'd thought it was responsible. Now I saw it for what it was, preparation. And Vanessa, my niece. Always around during wedding planning, always helping. I'd thought she was being a good cousin. Now I knew she'd been positioning herself, watching, reporting back. Every piece had been there. Every red flag waving right in front of my face. And I'd missed all of them because I'd been too busy being the proud father, too relieved, too blind. At 3 a.m, I opened Google and typed how to investigate someone. The search results loaded private investigators, background checks, due diligence guides. I read through them, taking notes, forming a plan. I needed to know everything about Danny Sullivan. His real background, his financials, any criminal record, his past relationships. I needed to understand Vanessa's involvement. When had this started? How deep was she in? Were there communications I could find, financial records proving the connection? Most importantly, I needed to know the plan. What were they going to do? How were they planning to get to that $10 million? But more than anything, I needed evidence. Real, solid evidence. Recordings, documents, witnesses, anything that would hold up. Because Lydia couldn't know until I had proof. If I went to her now with just an overheard conversation, Danny would deny everything. He'd convince her I was paranoid, jealous, unable to let go, and Vanessa would back him up. My own niece would lie to my daughter's face to protect a man who saw her cousin as a temporary inconvenience. At 5 in the morning, dawn began to break outside my window. I stood and watched the light spread across the estate grounds, the same grounds where Lydia had learned to ride a bike, where we'd hosted her graduation party, where yesterday morning I'd promised to protect her. I should have seen this coming. Should have asked harder questions, done background checks, trusted my instincts during the engagement. I should have been smarter, more careful, more suspicious. A good father would have protected his daughter before the threat materialized. But I hadn't. And now she was married to a man who wanted her dead. The guilt sat heavy in my chest. But beneath it, something harder was forming. Because even though I'd failed to see it coming, I knew now. And now that I knew, I was going to protect my daughter with everything I had. Every dollar, every connection, every ounce of strength left in me. Danny Sullivan had made a critical mistake. He'd underestimated what a father would do when his child was in danger. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen island watching the sun rise, waiting. At exactly 8 o'clock, I picked up my phone and made the first call. Henry Wallace. Henry, it's Mark Mitchell. Mark, congratulations on the wedding. I need to see you today. It's urgent. There was a pause. What's going on? I can't explain over the phone. Can you meet me at your office in an hour? Of course, I'll clear my schedule. Thank you. I hung up and dialed the second number. Murphy Investigations. Frank Murphy, please. Speaking. Mr. Murphy, my name is Mark Mitchell. James Cooper recommended you. I need to hire you for a very sensitive matter. What kind of matter? One, the kind that involves my daughter's safety and a son-in-law who's planning something I can't prove yet. A pause. I'm listening. Can we meet today? I can do 2 o'clock. I'll be there. The third call was the easiest. James. Mark, are you okay? I need you to meet me at Henry's office at 9. Can you make it? Of course. What's this about? Danny Sullivan, I said. And everything I heard last night. I'll be there. I hung up and set the phone down. The house was still quiet, but it felt different now. Not empty, focused. The war had begun. Wallace and Associates occupied the 15th floor of a glass tower in the financial district. I had been coming here for 20 years, but that morning the elevator ride felt longer than usual. Each passing floor gave me more time to rehearse what I planned to say, though I knew no rehearsal could make it sound sane. The doors opened. I stepped into the familiar reception area, mahogany furniture, law books lining the walls, the faint scent of coffee mixed with expensive cologne. Henry's assistant looked up. Mr. Mitchell, he's expecting you. Go right in. Henry Wallace stood by his office window when I entered, phone pressed to his ear. He turned, saw me, and his expression changed immediately. He ended the call and set the phone down. Mark, he said, crossing the room. You look terrible. I feel terrible. Sit down. He gestured to the leather chairs near his desk. What's going on? You sounded urgent. I sat. The words I had practiced vanished. Something happened at the wedding. Henry waited without interrupting. A woman who works at the venue, a janitor named Diana Foster, pulled me aside during the reception. She said I needed to hear something. She hid me in a storage closet, and I overheard Danny and Vanessa talking in the hallway. Vanessa, Henry repeated. Your niece. Yes. His face darkened. What did you hear? I told him everything. The way they stood close. The discussion about $10 million in life insurance. The casual way Danny said Lydia was useful for now. The question Vanessa asked about what would happen when she wasn't useful anymore. When I finished, Henry was silent. You're certain, he asked. I'm certain. He returned to his desk and opened his laptop. I need to review everything. Estate documents, insurance, trusts, succession plans. That's why I'm here. 20 minutes later, we sat across from each other with a stack of documents between us. Henry had printed everything and pulled up digital records on his screen. Let's start with life insurance, he said. He slid a document toward me. I recognized it immediately. $10 million policy, Henry said. Primary beneficiary, Lydia Mitchell. Right. But 6 months ago, you added a secondary beneficiary. He pointed. Daniel Sullivan. $6 million if both you and Lydia pass away. My stomach dropped. I didn't. You did, Henry said gently. That's your signature. Do you remember signing it? I stared at the page. The signature was mine. The date was February. Danny suggested it. I said slowly. He said it was standard. Said it would protect Lydia and the family. And you trusted him. Yes. Henry made a note. Next, the trust. He pulled up another document. $10 million trust established when Lydia turned 25. It was locked until she turned 35 or got married. She got married Saturday, which means the trust unlocked Sunday morning. Lydia now has full access, and as her spouse Danny has legal rights under California law. I swallowed hard. There's more, Henry said, opening another file. Your corporate succession plan. If you die, Lydia inherits your controlling shares. That was always the plan, but you added a clause 4 months ago. He turned the screen toward me. If Lydia inherits and then dies within 5 years, her spouse inherits her shares. My chest tightened. Danny suggested that too. It protects him, Henry said. If you die, then Lydia dies. Danny inherits a company worth $47 million. The room seemed to tilt. When did Danny first contact you, I asked. Henry checked his notes. February. He said he wanted to discuss estate planning as Lydia's future husband. What did he ask? At first, normal things. Then he asked what would happen if you became incapacitated. Who would make decisions for you? Incapacitated, I repeated. He wanted details. I walked to the window, staring down at the city below. People moved through their lives, unaware that a father was realizing his daughter had married a man planning her death. He's been setting this up for months, I said. Yes. And if I go to the police now, it's hearsay. Henry didn't argue. Can we change everything, I asked. Today, we can, he said carefully. But any change triggers notifications. Danny would know within 24 hours, and then he might act faster. Or turn Lydia against you. I closed my eyes. Then what do I do? We need evidence, Henry said. Proof of intent. I already have an investigator, I said. Frank Murphy. Henry nodded. Good choice. I left with copies of every document. The elevator doors were closing when my phone buzzed. A text from Danny. Hey, Mark, hope you're recovering from the wedding. Want to grab lunch this week? Thursday, 4 days away. I typed back Thursday works. The Prime House, my treat. I stared at the screen, then replied, sounds good. I put the phone away and waited. The corner cafe sat on a quiet street 3 blocks from the financial district. It was the kind of place businessmen used for meetings they didn't want. Overheard booths with high backs, ambient noise from the coffee machine's staff, who knew not to linger. I arrived 10 minutes early Tuesday morning and took a booth in the back corner. The waitress brought coffee without asking. I wrapped my hands around the mug and waited. Frank Murphy walked in at exactly 10 o'clock. I recognized him immediately from the photo on his website, mid-40s, solid build, the kind of face that had seen things and remembered them. He scanned the room, once spotted me, and crossed the cafe with the economical movement of someone who'd spent years in uniform. Mark Mitchell, he asked. Frank Murphy. We shook hands. His grip was firm and brief. He slid into the booth across from me and declined the waitress's offer of coffee. Let's start with what you know, he said. I told him everything. The wedding, Diana's warning, the storage closet, the conversation I'd overheard between Danny and Vanessa, the meeting with Henry Wallace, and the documents we'd reviewed, the life insurance, the trust fund, the succession plan. The way Danny had positioned himself perfectly over 6 months. Frank listened without interrupting. He didn't take notes, didn't pull out a phone or recorder, just listened with the focused attention of someone trained to hear what people weren't saying as much as what they were. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You've been in business 40 years, he said finally. 42, and you're successful, very successful. I've done well. So that means you have good instincts," Frank said. "You can read people. You know when something doesn't add up. Those instincts have kept you alive in a world where one bad deal can ruin you." I nodded. "So when those same instincts tell you something's wrong with your son-in-law, you should trust them." He leaned forward slightly. "I've been doing this work for 15 years. Before that, I was LAPD for 12. I've seen hundreds of cases like this, financial predators who target families, build trust, position themselves, then strike. And you know what they all have in common? What? The family members always say the same thing afterward. I knew something was off, but I didn't want to believe it. You're different. You're believing it now before it's too late." Something loosened in my chest. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet," Frank said. "Let's talk about what we can do." He pulled out a small notepad, old school, no electronics. "Investigation scope," he said. "First, Daniel Sullivan's background. I'll pull everything I can find. Employment history going back 10 years. Credit reports, criminal records if they exist, past relationships, bankruptcies, lawsuits, anything that shows a pattern." "Good. Second, Vanessa Reed, your niece. I need to know her involvement. When did this start? How deep is she in? I'll look at her financials, phone records, if we can get them legally, social media, any communications between her and Danny." How do you get phone records legally?" "Subpoena if it goes to court, but that's later. For now, I have contacts who can pull metadata, call logs, text, timestamps, location data. Nothing that violates wiretapping laws, but enough to show patterns." I nodded. "Third, surveillance. I'll put eyes on Danny. Where he goes, who he meets, what he does when he thinks no one's watching. If he's meeting with Vanessa regularly, I'll document it. If there are other people involved, I'll find them." "Other people." "These things are rarely just two people," Frank said. "There's usually a network. Friends who know accomplices who help, sometimes professionals hired for specific tasks." The thought made my stomach turn. "Fourth, digital forensics. If Danny's planning something, there's a digital trail. Emails, texts, searches, financial transactions. I have a guy who specializes in this, completely legal methods, publicly available information, social engineering where appropriate." "How long will this take?" "Preliminary findings by Thursday," Frank said. "That's 2 days. I'll work fast because I understand the urgency. But a full investigation, the kind that builds an airtight case, could take weeks. I don't know if we have weeks." "Then we focus on the immediate threat first," Frank said. "Evidence of imminent danger. Anything that shows Danny or Vanessa planning something specific in the near term." He set the notepad down and looked at me directly. "I should mention something," he said. "Diana Foster, the woman who warned you. What about her?" "She's my cousin. Well, second cousin, technically. We grew up in the same neighborhood. She called me Sunday morning and told me what happened. Said she'd given you her card, and that you might reach out." I stared at him. "You already knew." "I knew what Diana saw and heard," Frank corrected. "But I wanted to hear your side before I took the case. Wanted to make sure this wasn't just a misunderstanding or an overreaction. And it's not," Frank said. "Diana has good instincts, too. If she says your son-in-law is dangerous, I believe her." Relief flooded through me. "Thank you for taking this seriously." "I take everything seriously," Frank said. "Especially when it involves a man who's been systematically positioning himself to inherit $47 million. He pulled a small device from his jacket pocket and slid it across the table. It looked like a pen, a recording device, he said. Voice activated, legal in California under one-party consent law. As long as you're part of the conversation, you can record it without the other person's knowledge. You want me to record Danny? I want you to record everything, Frank said. Especially that lunch on Thursday. If he says anything incriminating, anything about his plans, about Lydia, about you, we need it on record. I picked up the pen, feeling its weight. What if he notices? He won't. It's designed to look exactly like a standard ballpoint. Just keep it in your shirt pocket, click it once to activate, click twice to deactivate. I slipped it into my jacket. One more thing, Frank said, his voice serious. Men like Danny, when they feel threatened, they escalate. If he figures out you're investigating him, he might move faster than planned. You need to be careful. Don't let him know you suspect anything. I'm having lunch with him Thursday. When I know, act normal. Be the proud father-in-law. Ask about the honeymoon. Laugh at his jokes. And record every word. We discussed the retainer $5,000, which I transferred to his account before we left the booth. Frank gave me his card, told me to call or text anytime, day or night. He'd send preliminary findings by email Wednesday evening, with a full briefing before my Thursday lunch. One last thing, Frank said as we stood to leave. Your daughter. Does she know any of this? No. I keep it that way until we have proof. If you go to her now with suspicions, Danny will turn her against you. He's had 2 years to build trust with her. You'll be fighting an uphill battle. I know. We'll get the evidence, Frank said. And when we do, she'll see the truth. We shook hands again, and he left through the front entrance. I watched him go, then pulled out my phone to check the time. A text notification appeared on the screen. From Lydia, Dad, we're back from the honeymoon. It was amazing, miss you so much. Can we do lunch or dinner this week, maybe Thursday or Friday? I stared at the message. My daughter, happy, excited, completely unaware that the man sleeping beside her every night was planning her death. The man I'd helped create the perfect trap for. My hands trembled as I typed. Thursday lunch won't work, I have a meeting. How about next week? I want to hear all about the trip. The response came immediately. Okay, love you, Dad. The email arrived at 3 o'clock Tuesday afternoon, while I was sitting alone in my home office, checking my inbox every 5 minutes, like a man waiting for test results he didn't want to see. When Frank's name appeared in bold, my heart kicked hard against my ribs. The subject line said preliminary findings, and there was a password-protected attachment. I typed in the street name where we'd met that morning, and the document opened. I read it twice. Then I read it again because I needed to be absolutely certain I wasn't misunderstanding what Frank had found. Danny Sullivan was 35 years old, born in Chicago to an upper-middle-class family. His father had owned a regional construction supply company. His mother had been a school administrator. Everything had been normal until Danny turned 22 and the 2008 recession hit. The family business went bankrupt. 6 months later, his father died by suicide. 2 years after that, his mother died of cancer. Danny had been left alone, traumatized, and apparently bent on making sure he'd never be vulnerable again. The financial picture Frank uncovered was catastrophic. Danny owed $320,000 student loans from an MBA program he'd never finished, credit card debt across 7 different cards, and gambling losses documented through casino records and online betting platforms. He'd built this mountain of debt while presenting himself as a successful financial advisor, and somehow he'd hidden it from everyone, including Lydia. But that wasn't the worst part. Frank had traced multiple offshore accounts in Danny's name, accounts in the Cayman Islands, with suspicious transfers totaling about $180,000 over the past 2 years. The source of that money was unclear, But one recent withdrawal stood out like a flare in the dark: $100,000. Transferred directly to Vanessa Reed's personal checking account 2 months ago. $100,000. To my niece. For setting up my daughter like a target in a shooting gallery. Frank had also tracked down a woman named Jessica Morrison. She was 31, now the daughter of a tech executive worth about $200 million. Back in 2018, she dated Danny for 4 months. She told Frank's investigator that Danny had been charming, at first attentive, genuinely interested in her, or so she'd thought. Then, he'd started asking questions about her trust fund. How it worked. Who controlled it? What would happen if something happened to her father? When she caught him trying to forge her signature on documents that would have given him power of attorney over her accounts, she confronted him. He denied it, then broke down crying, said he was desperate and needed help. She hadn't pressed charges because she'd felt sorry for him, but she'd warned him never to contact her again. He never did. He'd just moved on to the next target. That's what Frank's report called it. A pattern. Danny targeted wealthy women, established trust, positioned himself for financial gain through manipulation or fraud. And Lydia had been next in line. Vanessa's part in all this was just as calculated. Frank found that she was drowning in debt too, $280,000 between student loans, credit cards, and a defaulted business loan. Her income as a real estate agent wasn't nearly enough to cover it. She'd been facing bankruptcy when Danny came back into her life. They'd dated 5 years ago, broken up badly, then reconnected 18 months ago. Frank's timeline showed that reconnection happened right when Danny started planning his approach to Lydia. Vanessa had received $20,000 from one of Danny's offshore accounts 16 months ago, right before she'd arranged for Danny to coincidentally meet Lydia at a charity event. Then 2 months ago, she'd gotten another $100,000. Frank had laid out the entire timeline in the report. 18 months ago, Danny and Vanessa reconnected. 16 months ago, Vanessa got her first payment. 15 months ago, Danny met Lydia with Vanessa right there to make the introduction look natural. 12 months ago, they started dating. 9 months ago, they got engaged with Vanessa as maid of honor to keep watch and report back. 6 months ago, Danny got himself added to my life insurance policy and met with Henry Wallace to ask about what would happen if I became incapacitated. 2 months ago, Vanessa got her big payday. And now, Lydia was married to a man who'd spent over a year positioning himself to inherit at least $47 million if both she and I died within the right time frame. The worst part, the part that made me have to stand up and walk away from the computer because I couldn't sit still anymore, was the digital forensics section. Frank had managed to pull search queries from Danny's computer through what he called legal means, though I didn't ask for details. The searches told me everything I needed to know about Danny's intentions. He'd looked up substances that were undetectable in autopsies. He'd researched how to stage home accidents. He'd studied California spousal inheritance law and how long it took for life insurance to pay out after a death. He'd looked into power of attorney requirements and the differences between dementia symptoms and medication side effects. He'd Googled the exact methods he planned to use to kill us. At the bottom of the report, Frank had written a note in what I assumed was meant to draw my attention. He said Danny had begun planning this operation before he ever met Lydia. She wasn't a romantic interest who'd become a target, she'd been the target from the beginning. The entire relationship was constructed as a means to access the Mitchell family fortune. Frank recommended immediate protective measures and said Danny was sophisticated, patient, and extremely dangerous. I sat back down at my desk and stared at the screen until my eyes burned. Lydia wasn't a person to Danny Sullivan. She was a business plan. A $470 million business plan disguised as a love story. And I'd walked her down the aisle and handed her over. I'd signed the documents that made him a beneficiary. I'd smiled and given toasts while he was already planning how to kill her and make it look like an accident. My phone buzzed with a reminder I'd set that morning. Tomorrow. Lunch with Danny. 12:30 at the Prime House. I stared at that reminder for a long time. Tomorrow I'd sit across from the man who'd spent 15 months manipulating my daughter into marrying him so he could kill her for money. I'd shake his hand and ask about the honeymoon and laugh at whatever jokes he told. I'd act like the proud father-in-law who couldn't be happier about how things had turned out. Because if Danny suspected for even a second that I knew what he was planning, he might move faster. And Lydia would be dead before I could figure out how to save her. Wednesday passed in a blur of anxious planning. I met with Frank, twice practiced with the recording device, and rehearsed conversations with Danny until the words lost meaning. Thursday morning arrived too fast and too slow at the same time. The Prime House sat in the financial district dark wood leather booths, the kind of prices that separated serious businessmen from tourists. I'd been closing deals here for years. Today it felt like walking into a trap I'd built for myself. Danny was already seated when I arrived at 12:30, looking relaxed in a tailored suit. He stood when he saw me, that same easy smile I'd fallen for 2 years ago. "Mark, good to see you." He shook my hand warmly. "I ordered us the Camus. Hope that's all right." "Perfect," I said, sliding into the booth. The recording pen was in my shirt pocket, already running. 3 booths away, James Cooper sat alone with a newspaper. He didn't look at me, but I knew he was there. Frank had insisted on backup. "How have you been?" Danny asked, pouring wine. "Feel like we haven't really talked since the wedding." "Oh, busy week. You know how it is." He raised his glass. "To family." I touched my glass to his and took a small sip. Everything Danny chose was always excellent. That was part of his talent, refined taste, sophisticated judgment. A man who saw my daughter as an asset to acquire and liquidate. "Lydia's been talking non-stop about the honeymoon," Danny said. "Maldives was incredible. She texted me photos. Looked beautiful. She is beautiful. I'm the luckiest guy in the world." The waiter appeared, and Danny ordered for both of us tomahawk ribeye for 2 sides, another bottle of wine. He did it smoothly, confidently, like a man used to being in control. "I wanted to talk to you about something," Danny said once the waiter left. "Succession planning. You've built something incredible, Mark. But if anything ever happened to you, God forbid, Lydia would need support. Someone who understands the business. I appreciate that, but I'm not planning on going anywhere anytime soon." "Of course not. You're in great health. What did your doctor say at your last checkup?" "Clean bill of health. Said I could live another 30 years if I keep doing what I'm doing." I watched his face carefully. For just a fraction of a second, something flickered. Disappointment, frustration, gone so fast I almost missed it. "That's wonderful," Danny said smoothly. "Really wonderful." In fact, I continued testing him. "I'm thinking about training for a marathon. There's one in 6 months. Danny's smile tightened. "A marathon at 62. Why not? Is that safe? The strain on your heart, the risk of injury?" "I'd hate to see you hurt yourself. I'm not trying to prove anything, just staying active." "Of course. Just seems like a lot of risk for someone in your position. You have responsibilities, people depending on you." The food arrived. We ate in silence for a few minutes. Then Danny set down his knife and looked at me directly. "I think it's important we get everything in order. Estate documents, insurance policies, succession plans. Make sure Lydia's protected." "Everything's in order. Yeah, I know Henry Wallace is excellent. But maybe we should review everything together. Make sure there aren't any gaps, any scenarios we haven't covered." "What kind of scenarios?" "Accidents, for instance. If something happened to you, suddenly a car accident, a fall, we need to make sure Lydia has immediate access to resources." I set down my fork. "Danny, I'm not planning to have any accidents." He laughed, but there was an edge to it. "Nobody plans for accidents, Mark. That's why they're called accidents. But they happen. And when they do, the people we love need to be taken care of. The way he said it, so reasonable, so concerned, would have sounded perfectly normal to anyone else. But I heard what was underneath. The impatience. The frustration that I wasn't cooperating with his timeline. "How's Vanessa doing?" I asked, changing the subject deliberately. "I haven't heard from her since the wedding." Danny's jaw tightened. "She's fine, busy with work. She seemed stressed at the reception." "She's fine," he repeated, his tone closing the door. His phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it, and I saw his expression change. The smooth charm cracked for just a second. It buzzed again and again. "I'm sorry," Danny said, standing abruptly. "I need to take this." He walked toward the restroom's phone pressed to his ear. I glanced toward James. He gave me the smallest nod. Danny was gone for 5 minutes. When he came back, his entire energy had shifted. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by something tighter, more urgent. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Fine. Just work stuff." He sat down but didn't touch his food. "Listen, Mark, about those documents. I really think we should meet with Henry next week. Tuesday, maybe. Why the rush?" "Then it's not a rush. It's being responsible. For Lydia's sake. She's my wife now, and I need to make sure she's protected." He was pushing too hard. I could see it, and part of me wondered if he could see that I could see it. "Let me check my schedule," I said. We finished lunch with strained small talk. Danny insisted on paying. Outside on the sidewalk, he put his hand on my shoulder, heavy, possessive. "I hope you'll be with us for a long, long time," he said. "Lydia needs her father. We both do." "I'm not going anywhere," I said. He smiled, squeezed my shoulder once more, then walked to his car, a brand new BMW he'd bought himself with money he didn't have. I watched him drive away, and for the first time since Saturday night, I felt genuine fear. Not for myself. For Lydia. That was painful to watch. I turned. James had appeared beside me. "It was worse than I expected," I said. "Mark." Frank Murphy was standing across the street. He crossed over to us, his expression dark. "I got it all," he said quietly. "Every word. And that phone call, that was Vanessa. I had someone listening on her line." My heart stopped. "What did she say?" Frank met my eyes. "She said, they're asking questions. I think the old man knows. I invited Lydia to dinner Friday evening at the estate. Just the two of us," I told her. I said I wanted to hear about the honeymoon properly, without the rush of texts and phone calls. She sounded happy when she agreed, and that happiness made what I was about to do even harder. I made lasagna using Penelope's recipe, the one Lydia had loved since she was 7 years old. It felt right having her mother's cooking at the table for this conversation. I needed all the help I could get. Lydia arrived at 7, glowing in a way I hadn't seen in years. Marriage looked good on her, or at least the idea of it did. She hugged me tightly and said she'd missed me. For a moment, I considered saying nothing at all, letting her stay happy for one more evening before I destroyed everything. But I couldn't. Not after what Frank had uncovered. Not after Thursday's lunch with Danny. We ate and talked about the Maldives, the beaches, the food, the resort that had exceeded all their expectations. She showed me photos, and I smiled and nodded at the right moments. But my thoughts were racing ahead. After her second helping and coffee, I set down my cup and looked at her. "Lydia, I need to talk to you about Danny." Her smile faded. "What about him? I need you to listen all the way through. Please." She put down her cup. "Dad, what's going on? Have you noticed anything strange about him? Anything that doesn't add up?" She frowned. "What are you talking about?" I had practiced this conversation with Frank, but every plan vanished. "At the wedding," I said. "Someone who worked there warned me about Danny." She hid me, and I overheard a conversation between Danny and Vanessa. Her face went pale. "You were eavesdropping at my wedding." "It wasn't like that. You were hiding and listening to private conversations." "Lydia, please." "They were talking about money, life insurance. Danny said you were useful for now, and Vanessa asked what would happen when you weren't. She stood so fast her chair scraped. Stop. I know how this sounds. You're telling me you spied on my husband and twisted his words into some conspiracy. It's not a theory. I hired someone to investigate him. Her eyes widened. You hired a private investigator? I had to. You had to what? Prove my marriage is a mistake. Her voice shook. Is it impossible to believe someone loves me? I pulled the folder from beside me, Frank's reports neatly organized. Danny's debts, Jessica Morrison's testimony, offshore accounts, Vanessa's involvement, searches about undetectable substances and staged accidents. Look at this, I said, sliding it toward her. Please. She stared at it like it might bite. I'm not reading lies you paid for. They're public records. Danny has over $300,000 in debt. He tried to steal from a woman he dated in 2018. He and Vanessa reconnected before he met you. It's documented. Stop it. You're in danger, I said. He's planning something. You want me to believe my husband is a con artist, and my cousin helped him. She laughed bitterly. Do you hear yourself? I know it's hard. It's impossible, because it's not true. She grabbed her purse. You can't stand that I'm happy, that I found someone who loves me without your money. That's not this. Isn't it you've been alone since Mom died? Now you can't let go, so you try to sabotage my marriage. I'm trying to protect you from what being loved. Tears filled her eyes. Do you think I'm unworthy of real love? That's not what I'm saying. All I hear is that you don't trust me, that you think I'm stupid. I think Danny is dangerous. She laughed without humor. Mom would be ashamed of you. The words knocked the air out of me. What? She always said you were controlling. I defended you. But this... She gestured at the folder. This is sick. Digging up dirt to poison my marriage. Mom would hate this. I couldn't speak. Lydia turned for the door. I followed, desperate, but she stopped in the foyer. When you're ready to apologize, she said coldly, let me know. Until then, don't contact me. She slammed the door and drove away. I stood in the silence, then returned to the table. The lasagna sat untouched. Penelope's recipe. The folder of evidence she refused to read. My phone buzzed. A text from Danny. Hey, Mark. Lydia told me about dinner. I get it, you want to protect her. No hard feelings. Want to grab drinks tomorrow, just us guys. I stared at the screen. He knew. Vanessa had warned him. Lydia confirmed it. And instead of retreating, he was inviting me out. Somewhere private. I set the phone down and looked at the empty chair, the cold lasagna, the unread evidence. I'd tried to save my daughter and lost her instead. Frank's call woke me at 7 Saturday morning. I hadn't slept more than 2 hours, lying awake replaying my argument with Lydia and staring at Danny's text invitation. When my phone rang, I answered on the first ring. We have a problem, Frank said. I sat up. What kind of problem? The kind that means tonight is more dangerous than we thought. Get to your computer. I need to show you something. 5 minutes later, I sat in my home office staring at Frank's face on a video call. He looked as exhausted as I felt. I've been monitoring Danny's digital activity, he said. 3 days ago, he made several purchases from a chemical supply company. Laboratory-grade compounds with no legitimate use for someone like him. He shared his screen. Order confirmations filled the display. Frank highlighted one section. Rare alkaloid compounds, he said. In small doses, they mimic food poisoning or natural illness. They're virtually undetectable unless doctors know exactly what to test for. My stomach clenched. He's planning to poison someone. That's my conclusion. And yesterday, Vanessa Reed bought a burner phone in Pasadena, paid cash. That's not normal behavior. What else? Frank's jaw tightened. Danny's car has passed your estate 4 times in the last 2 days. Not driven by. Passed. Like he's mapping the place. More screenshots appeared. His search history from last night includes food poisoning symptoms and emergency room response times. He's planning something soon. I struggled to breathe as the evidence stacked higher. There's more, Frank said. I spoke with Jessica Morrison again. She finally told the full story. Danny didn't attempt forgery once. He spent 3 months creating fraudulent documents to seize control of her trust. When her father confronted him, Danny became violent, destroyed furniture, made threats. Her father paid him $50,000 to make him disappear. Jesus. Jessica wanted me to warn you. She said Danny becomes extremely dangerous when cornered. The man you see isn't who he really is. I stood and stared out the window at the estate grounds. Danny had driven past this house multiple times studying it. What do we do? I asked. That depends on you, Frank said. Danny knows you're suspicious. Vanessa warned him. Lydia confirmed it. Now he has 2 options, retreat or accelerate. Which will he choose? He'll accelerate. He's 18 months into this plan, buried in debt. Tonight's drink invitation isn't friendly. It's strategic. You think he'll try something tonight. I think he'll probe you, test how much you know. And if he feels threatened, he may act. Have you contacted police? Yes. Detective Amanda Brooks. Financial crimes. She's interested, but needs more proof. Right now, it's circumstantial. We need Danny on record. That's why I'm going, Frank nodded. And we'll take precautions. I'm upgrading your recorder. It has GPS tracking. I'll be in a surveillance van nearby. James Cooper will be inside the bar. Patrol units will be on standby. What if things go wrong? We'll use a code word. If you say Penelope, we move immediately. But Mark, if you trigger it without proof of immediate danger, we lose our shot. Danny lawyers up and disappears. I understand. Frank leaned forward. This isn't business. Danny has researched poisoning. He's scouted your home. He's turned violent before. If tonight goes sideways, it will go fast. Footsteps sounded downstairs. James called my name. I have to go, I said. Send me the details. Be careful. He has nothing left to lose. I ended the call and went downstairs. James stood in the foyer, still wearing yesterday's clothes. Don't go, he said. James, I mean it. Let Frank handle this. Let the police. If I don't go, Danny changes tactics. And Lydia becomes the next target. Then we protect Lydia. Show her the evidence. She won't believe it. I tried last night. She thinks I'm controlling. James was silent. So what's your plan? I go. I wear the wire. I get him talking. We get evidence. Then it ends. And if he realizes you're recording, I say Penelope. And if help doesn't arrive in time, I had no answer. James shook his head. You're walking into a trap. Maybe. But it's the only way to save Lydia. She won't leave him without proof. I looked out at the rising sun over the estate. I'd spent 40 years building this life. I'd survived poverty recessions and losing Penelope. But I'd never faced someone who wanted me erased. In business, rivals want to beat you. They don't want you dead. Danny didn't want to beat me. He wanted to replace me. He wanted my company, my wealth, my life, and the only thing between him and $47 million was me and my daughter. That made me dangerous. Not because I was ruthless, but because I had something to protect. And a father protecting his daughter is the most dangerous man alive. The Anchor was the kind of bar where businessmen went to close deals over expensive whiskey and pretend they were still young enough to drink on a Saturday night. I arrived at 7 exactly and found Danny already seated in a corner booth, 2 glasses of amber liquid waiting on the table. He stood when he saw me, that practiced smile in place. Mark, thanks for coming. I know things have been tense. They have, I said, sliding into the booth across from him. The recording device was in my shirt pocket, already activated. 3 booths away, James sat at the bar nursing a beer, his back to us, but positioned so he could see everything in the mirror behind the bottles. Danny pushed one of the glasses toward me. Your favorite, Macallan 25. I thought we could clear the air properly. I looked at the glass. The whiskey was expensive, probably $60 a pour in a place like this. But it had been sitting there for a while. I could see the condensation on the outside of the glass, the slight separation of color at the top, where it had been exposed to air. Actually, I said, my stomach's been a little off today. I probably shouldn't. Something flickered across Danny's face. Frustration, anger. It was gone in an instant, replaced by concern. Come on, he said, picking up his own glass. Just one drink. For family. We need to get past this misunderstanding. The word misunderstanding hung in the air between us. As if my daughter's safety was just a communication problem. To family. Danny said, raising his glass and waiting for me to do the same. The social pressure was immense. If I refused to drink, he'd know something was wrong. But if I drank from a glass, he'd had sitting here before I arrived a glass I hadn't watched being poured. I picked up the glass, brought it to my lips, pretended to take a sip while barely letting the liquid touch my mouth. Danny's eyes narrowed. You haven't drunk yet. I did. No, you didn't. I saw you. Come on, Mark. One real sip. We're trying to move forward here. There was no way out. I took a small sip, the smallest I could manage, without making it obvious I was avoiding it. The whiskey hit my tongue and I almost gagged. Underneath the smoky, peaty flavor of the Macallan was something else. Something bitter and chemical that didn't belong. I swallowed and set the glass down. There. Happy, very. Danny took a long drink from his own glass, watching me over the rim. Now about this private investigator business. I understand you're concerned about Lydia. That's natural. But hiring someone to dig into my background, that crosses a line. He kept talking something about the insurance changes being standard procedure, about wanting to protect Lydia's interests, about how much he loved my daughter. But I wasn't really listening anymore. I was focused on the heat spreading through my chest, the way my heartbeat was starting to accelerate, the slight dizziness that was making the room tilt at the edges. Have another sip, Danny said, gesturing at my glass. You've barely touched it. I'm good. You sure it's really excellent whiskey? I'm sure. But he kept pushing, kept bringing the conversation back to the drinks, to taking another sip, to relaxing and enjoying the evening. And eventually, to avoid making him suspicious, I took another small sip. That was a mistake. The heat in my chest became a fire. My heart was racing now, pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Sweat broke out across my forehead and the back of my neck. The room wasn't just tilting anymore, it was spinning. I tried to keep my face neutral, to not let Danny see what was happening. But it was getting harder to breathe, harder to focus on his words. You okay? Danny asked, leaning forward with what looked like genuine concern. You look flushed. Just hot in here. You want me to ask them to turn down the heat? No, I'm fine. But I wasn't fine. My hands were shaking. My vision was starting to blur at the edges. Even those 2 tiny sips had been enough. Whatever he'd put in that whiskey was working fast. I need to use the restroom, I said, starting to stand. My legs didn't work right. I had to grip the edge of the table to keep from falling, then reach out and steady myself against the wall. The few steps to the bathroom felt like miles. I heard footsteps behind me. For a terrified second, I thought it was Danny, but then James's voice said quietly, I've got you. He helped me to the bathroom, and I barely made it to a stall before my stomach emptied violently. James stood outside, keeping watch, his presence the only thing keeping me from complete panic. What happened? He asked, when I finally emerged, pale and shaking. The drink. He put something in it. Jesus. We need to get you to a hospital, now. The glass, I said. We need the glass. Evidence. Forget the glass. Get the glass, James, please. He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. Stay here. He left, and I leaned against the sink, staring at my reflection. My face was gray. My pupils were dilated. I looked like a man who'd just been poisoned by his own son-in-law. When I came out of the bathroom, Danny was standing near our booth, looking concerned in a way that would have seemed genuine if I didn't know better. "Mark, you don't look good. Should I call an ambulance?" "Oh, no." The word came out harsher than I intended. "James is going to drive me home. It's just food poisoning, something I ate earlier." "Are you sure? Because you really don't look—" "I'm fine." James appeared with his jacket, which he'd wrapped around something, the glass, I realized. He'd taken the glass. "Come on," James said, putting his hand under my arm. "Let's get you out of here." We made it to the parking lot before my legs gave out completely. I collapsed against James's car, and he immediately pulled out his phone. "I'm calling 911, he said. "No, Mark, you've been poisoned. We're going to the hospital and we're calling the police." I wanted to argue, but I couldn't form the words anymore. The world was spinning too fast. My heart was beating too hard. Everything was going dark at the edges. I heard James on the phone. Heard him give the address. Heard him say possible poisoning, and we have evidence. Through the haze, I turned my head back toward the bar. Through the window, I could see Danny still sitting in our booth. He wasn't calling Lydia, wasn't rushing out to see if I needed help. He was just sitting there, perfectly calm, sipping his whiskey like nothing unusual had happened. Our eyes met through the glass, and he smiled. Not the charming smile he used with Lydia. Not the professional smile he used with business associates. This was something else entirely. Something cold and satisfied. The smile of a man watching his plan unfold exactly as he'd designed it. The ambulance arrived with sirens wailing. As the paramedics loaded me onto the stretcher, I kept my eyes on that window, on Danny Sullivan sitting alone in that booth, watching me being taken away. He raised his glass in a small salute and took another sip of his whiskey. I woke to machines beeping and the smell of disinfectant. For a confused moment, I didn't know where I was. Then the memories came back, the bar, the whiskey, Danny's smile. "Dad." Lydia's face appeared above me, tear-streaked and pale. She grabbed my hand. "You scared me to death. They said you were poisoned." If James hadn't called 911, her voice broke. "I'm okay, I managed." The door opened. A woman in a white coat entered, checking monitors. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm Dr. Jennifer Hayes. You're very lucky. The preliminary toxicology results show unusual compounds in your system. Not typical food poisoning." Lydia looked between us. "What does that mean?" Dr. Hayes chose her words carefully. "This wasn't accidental. We're required to report these findings to authorities. A detective will want to speak with you." She left, saying she'd check back in an hour. Lydia turned to me, frightened. "Dad, what did you eat? Where did you go?" "I met Danny for drinks." Her face went still. Last night, he texted me Friday, asked if we could talk. "And you got sick after drinks with Danny." Not a question. Her voice had gone flat. "Lydia, tell me everything. Don't leave anything out this time." So I did. Diana Foster at the wedding, hiding in the storage closet, overhearing Danny and Vanessa, hiring Frank Murphy, the debts, offshore accounts, Jessica Morrison, the chemicals Danny purchased, his search history about accidents, last night's pre-poured drinks, the bitter taste. I pulled the recording device from my jacket. I was wearing this. "Play it." We listened to Danny's voice. The impatience when I tried to refuse. The false concern when symptoms started. When it ended, Lydia sat perfectly still. "There's more," I said quietly. Frank Murphy knocked and entered with a briefcase. "Mrs. Sullivan, I'm Frank Murphy." "Show me," Lydia said, hands shaking. Frank laid out documents. "The glass from the bar. James gave it to me. We had it analyzed." He pointed to a report. "Danny's fingerprints, Chemical compounds matching what's in your father's bloodstream. He loaded a video on his tablet. Security footage from the anchor. Watch. On screen, Danny arrived 20 minutes early. Ordered 2 drinks. Pulled something from his pocket and dropped it into one glass. Stirred it with his finger. Waited. Lydia made a small sound. Frank pulled out a printed email. Intercepted this morning. Danny to Vanessa Reed. Lydia read aloud, trembling. It's done. Now we wait. If the old man doesn't make it, we move on Lydia next. If he does, we accelerate the timeline. Either way, we're close. The paper slipped from her fingers. He tried to kill you, she whispered. Sweetheart, I brought him into our family. I defended him. This is my fault. No. I grabbed her hand. His fault. Only his. He's a predator. He fooled a lot of people. She was crying now, whole body shaking. I pulled her into a hug and let her fall apart the way she used to when she was small. Except this time, the thing that hurt her was the man she'd married. When she pulled back, her eyes were clear. What do we do? Are you willing to help us catch him? She looked at the evidence. The glass. The email. The video. He tried to kill my father, she said, voice cold. Yes. Whatever it takes. A knock on the door. Danny walked in, carrying flowers, concern on his face. He stopped when he saw us, me sitting up, Lydia beside me, Frank with his briefcase. For just a fraction of a second, his eyes swept over me, taking in my color, my alertness. The fact that I was alive, and I saw it. The disappointment. Raw and undeniable. Gone so fast you'd miss it if you weren't looking. But I was looking, and so was Lydia. Mark. Danny said, concern sliding back. Thank God you're okay. That's wonderful news. He set the flowers down and smiled at Lydia. Honey, I came as soon as I heard. Why didn't you call me? I needed to be with my father, Lydia said carefully. Of course. Danny glanced at Frank, then at me. I won't stay long. I just wanted to see you were all right. I appreciate that, I said. He lingered as if waiting for something. When none came, he smiled. I'll check in later. Get some rest, Mark. Lydia, call me when you're ready to come home. He left, closing the door gently. We sat in silence. He was disappointed, Lydia said quietly. When he saw you were okay. Yes, I said. Now I saw it too, Frank added. That wasn't worry. That was someone whose plan didn't work. Lydia walked to the window, staring out. When she turned back, grief was buried under something harder. What do we do? Frank closed his briefcase. We build a case. The glass is good, but we need more. We need him to incriminate himself on record. How? We make him think he's winning, I said. That I'm too sick to be a threat. That you still trust him. Lydia went pale. You want to use me as bait? No. I want to give him enough rope to hang himself. But I won't put you in danger. I'm already in danger, Lydia said. That email said if you survived, they'd move on to me next. At least this way we're controlling it. Frank looked between us. There's a detective I work with, Amanda Brooks. If we're doing this, we bring her in. Make it official. Do it, Lydia said. She looked at me, and I saw Penelope in her eyes, that same fierce determination. He hurt you. He planned to hurt me. He's not going to get away with it. I reached for her hand. Your mother would be proud of you. I hope so, because I'm terrified. Good. Fear keeps you careful. Frank gathered the evidence. I'll contact Detective Brooks today. Mark, you rest. Lydia, you go home and act like nothing's changed. Can you do that? I don't know, but I'll try. After Frank left, Lydia sat beside my bed. I loved him, she said finally. Or I thought I did. You loved who you thought he was. Well, how do I go home and look at him, sleep in the same bed? You think about why you're doing it, about the evidence we need. I squeezed her hand. And you remember you're not alone. If anything feels wrong, you call Frank immediately. I will. She kissed my forehead. I love you, Dad. I love you too, sweetheart. I watched her leave, walking out to face the man who'd tried to kill her father. And I prayed I was doing the right thing. Frank arrived Tuesday afternoon with a thick manila envelope and an expression I'd learned to read over the past week. This was the face he wore when he had something important. Full lab results, he said, spreading documents across the rolling table. Lydia pulled her chair closer, and we both leaned in. The compound they found in your system. Frank began pointing to a chemical analysis report. It's a rare alkaloid derivative, synthetic, not naturally occurring. Someone had to order this specifically, and they had to know what they were doing with it. What would it have done? Lydia asked quietly. Frank met her eyes. The dosage in that glass was calculated to cause severe illness leading to organ failure. A full glass would have killed your father within 24 to 48 hours. The fact that he only drank a small amount is the only reason he's sitting here. The room felt suddenly colder. The glass itself. Frank continued, pulling out another report. Danny's fingerprints are all over it. The rim, the base, the bottle the whiskey came from, and the chemical residue at the bottom matches exactly what's in your father's bloodstream. Timeline analysis shows it was added to the drink at least 15 minutes before Mark arrived. He laid out more documents. I traced the purchase. 4 days before your meeting, someone ordered these compounds from a chemical supply company that caters to research labs. The order was shipped to a P.O. box registered under the name D. Sullivan. Payment was made with a credit card linked to one of Danny's offshore accounts. That's premeditation, Lydia said. And that's exactly what it is. But there's more. Frank pulled out his tablet and opened a file. We recovered Danny's browser history from his cloud backup. He'd deleted it locally, but cloud data is harder to erase. 2 weeks ago, he was researching optimal dosages. 3 days ago, he looked up symptoms of alkaloid poisoning and how they present in emergency rooms. He scrolled to another section. And these are emails we recovered between Danny and Vanessa. 2 weeks ago, everything's ready. The day of your meeting, tonight. It happens tonight. And then after Mark survived, didn't work. He didn't drink enough. Now what? Lydia read over my shoulder, her hand gripping my arm. Vanessa responded, abort, he knows. And Danny said, no, too deep. Find another way. Find another way, I repeated. He's planning to try again. Yes, Frank said, which is why we need to be very careful about what happens next. The pattern is clear. This was calculated, systematic, premeditated murder. But we need to make sure everything we have will hold up in court. Will it? Lydia asked. Frank laid out 3 stacks of documents. The glass analysis solid. Danny's fingerprints, the chemical, match the timeline. That's physical evidence that will stand up anywhere. The purchase records, also solid. Clear paper trail from the chemical company to Danny's P.O. box to his offshore credit card. But some of these emails, he gestured to the 3rd stack. Those might be contested. We obtained them through a security vulnerability in the cloud service. A good defense attorney could argue they were illegally obtained. So what do? I asked. We get him to make another move, Frank said. But this time under controlled conditions, with police present. We catch him in the act, and then everything else becomes supporting evidence for a pattern of behavior. Lydia stood and walked to the window. You want to use me as bait again? Not bait, Frank corrected. A controlled operation. Your father pretends his health is declining. Danny thinks the poison is working slowly. You maintain the charade while secretly reporting his movements. We install surveillance in your apartment with your consent and a warrant, and we wait for him to make his move. How long? Detective Brooks is working on the warrant now. 2 to 3 weeks to build an airtight case. Lydia turned from the window. 2 to 3 weeks living with a man who's trying to kill my father, who's planning to kill me next, with 24/7 surveillance, Frank said. Cameras in every room, audio monitoring, and this. He pulled a small device from his pocket. Panic button. You press it, and police are at your door in under 3 minutes. You're never alone. We're always watching, said Lydia, I said. You don't have to do this. We can find another way. She looked at me, and her face was set in that expression I knew so well. The same one Penelope used to get when she'd made up her mind about something. Yes, I do. This has to end, and it has to end right. Not with him getting away on a technicality, not with him finding another target. This ends now with him in prison for the rest of his life. Frank nodded slowly. Then here's what happens. Mark, you're discharged tomorrow, but we spread the word that you're not recovering well. Complications from the poisoning. Internal damage. Lydia, you tell Danny the doctors are worried. You act scared. You lean on him for support. While he's planning to finish the job, Lydia said, while we're watching his every move, every search, every email, every conversation, and the second he makes a concrete move toward either of you, we close the trap. What about Vanessa? I asked. Detective Brooks will bring her in for questioning once we have enough on Danny. She'll flip. She's not a professional criminal, she's a real estate agent in over her head. When she sees the evidence, when she realizes she's looking at conspiracy to commit murder, she'll give up Danny to save herself. And if Danny figures out we're onto him before then, Frank met my eyes. Then Lydia uses the panic button, and we go in immediately. It won't be the perfect case we're building, but we'll have enough to hold him. That evening, I watched from my hospital window as Lydia walked to her car in the parking lot. She'd hugged me for a long time before leaving, and I'd made her promise to call if anything felt wrong, anything at all. Frank had installed cameras in her apartment that afternoon, while Danny was at work. Audio in the living room, bedroom, kitchen, a small lens in the smoke detector that could see the entire main living space. Everything recording to a secure server that Frank and Detective Brooks could access in real time. My phone buzzed. A text from Lydia. I'm home. Told him doctors are worried about internal damage to your organs, that you might not recover fully. I waited. Another text came through. He smiled, Dad, when I said that. He actually smiled. Before I could respond, my phone rang. Frank. Mark, we have a problem. Danny just opened his laptop. We're monitoring his search activity through the surveillance. He just Googled something. What? Frank's voice was grim. How to make death look like post-recovery complications from poisoning. My blood ran cold. Get her out of there, I said. Mark, if we pull her now. I don't care. Get her out. Now. There was a pause. Then Frank said, Okay. I'm sending the signal. Stay on the line. I pressed the phone to my ear and stared out the window at the city lights, at the apartment building a few miles away, where my daughter was sitting across from a man researching how to kill me and make it look natural. And I prayed that we hadn't waited too long. I didn't let Frank extract Lydia that night. Instead, I made a decision. We were too close. We had evidence, but not enough to guarantee Danny would spend the rest of his life in prison. Not yet. We needed more. We needed him confident, careless, convinced he was winning. So I became exactly what he wanted me to be, a dying man. Week 1, they discharged me Wednesday morning, and I made sure the performance was convincing. The slow walk to the car, the way I leaned on Lydia's arm, the exhaustion that wasn't entirely fake after days in the hospital. Dr. Hayes played her part perfectly. Before we left, she called Danny and Lydia into her office and delivered the news with calm professionalism. The internal damage is worse than we thought, she said. His liver function is declining. We're monitoring closely, but the prognosis is uncertain. Danny's face showed concern, But underneath it, I saw something else, satisfaction. How long, he asked. We'll know more in the coming weeks, Dr. Hayes replied. He needs rest and support. Danny volunteered immediately. He and Lydia would stay at the estate, help with everything, be there for me. I let him. That first week he hovered constantly, outside my bedroom, in doorways, always asking the same question. How are you feeling today, Mark? And every time I gave him exactly what he wanted to hear. Tired, so tired. I don't think I have much time left. Frank's cameras captured everything. Danny searching my office, flipping through financial documents, photographing pages. Thursday night, we recorded a call between him and Vanessa. It's working, Danny said. The poison is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. Slowly. How long, Vanessa asked. A few more weeks, maybe less. Every night, Lydia updated Frank using a burner phone hidden in her purse. Every morning, she met Frank and Detective Brooks at a coffee shop, while Danny thought she was at yoga. We built the case one recording at a time. Week 2, I graduated to a walker, let my hands shake, let him help me stand. Danny watched with open anticipation. The board meeting happened Tuesday. I joined by video and insisted Danny sit beside me. When I told the board I needed to step back temporarily, Danny was ready. I'll handle operations until Mark recovers, he said, his hand resting on my shoulder. They agreed. He received temporary executive authority. After the call ended, Frank's cameras showed Danny alone in my office, texting Vanessa. I'm in control now. Won't be long. He poured himself my bourbon and toasted Penelope's portrait. That week he made reckless decisions, moves I would never approve. I let him. Every unauthorized business action was documented. His internet searches escalated. How to detect suffocation by pillow, staging accidental overdose, fatal falls and recovering patients. Lydia watched the footage with me, pale. He's planning something soon. I know, I said. That's what we're waiting for. Week 3. The wheelchair was Frank's idea. Sell it completely, he said. I did. Let Danny push me through the house. Let him see how weak I'd become. Thursday, Henry Wallace arrived with documents. Loud enough for Danny to hear. Power of attorney, Henry said. Just a precaution. Danny appeared instantly. I signed the fake documents Henry had prepared. Danny watched every stroke of the pen. Just a precaution, he said afterward. You'll pull through. I hope so, I whispered. Friday, Vanessa visited the estate. Frank's cameras caught her and Danny in the garden. A detective's asking questions, Danny warned. Amanda Brooks. I haven't said anything, Vanessa said. 1 more week, Danny replied. Then we're free. Once he's dead, we wait deal with Lydia, and everything's ours. That night, Frank called an emergency meeting. All of us. Secure location. He said 1 week, Brooks said. That's our window. What's the plan, Lydia asked. Tomorrow morning, Frank said. Mark gets rushed to the hospital. Sudden decline. Danny panics. He makes a move. We catch him. That night, Lydia and I sat alone. I can't lose you, she said. You won't, I promised. Tomorrow this ends. The ambulance arrived at dawn. A staged emergency. Lydia cried into the phone, saying I couldn't breathe. As they loaded me onto the stretcher, I kept my eyes half closed. Danny stood in the doorway. He wasn't helping. He was texting. As the doors closed, I saw him watching us leave, calm and certain. The sun rose behind him. The trap was set. Here it is. The moment we've been waiting for 3 weeks. 3 hidden cameras in that hospital room. Detective Brooks is in the next room with her team. Frank is watching from the hallway, and I'm lying in bed, fitted with a recording device, pretending to be dying. Be honest, if your daughter's life were in danger, would you risk everything to save her? Share your thoughts in the comments. They admitted me that morning in critical condition. The doctors and nurses who weren't part of the operation believed it completely. I'd practiced the shallow breathing, the pale complexion, the weakness in my voice. Only Dr. Hayes and a small team knew the truth. The room was a private suite on the 4th floor, chosen specifically because the layout allowed surveillance. Cameras were hidden in the smoke detector, the television mount, the air vent cover. 3 angles covering every inch of the space. In the adjacent room, Detective Brooks sat with 2 officers watching multiple screens in real time. Frank was stationed in the cafeteria with a clear view of the elevators. The trap was set. Now we waited. Danny and Lydia arrived that afternoon. I heard them before I saw them. Lydia's voice tight with worry, Danny's low murmur of comfort. When they walked in, I had my eyes half closed. An oxygen cannula in my nose, monitors beeping steadily beside the bed. Dad. Lydia rushed to my side and grabbed my hand. Her fear was real, I knew. Even though she understood this was staged, the past 3 weeks had taken their toll. Dr. Hayes entered behind them, clipboard in hand, her expression professionally grim. The organ failure is progressing faster than we hoped. His liver function has declined significantly in the past 12 hours. I need to be honest with you, he may not survive the night. Lydia made a sound like she'd been struck. Danny's arm went around her shoulders immediately, and I watched through barely open eyes as he pulled her close. We'll get through this, he said, his voice tender. Together. I'm here for you. Dr. Hayes excused herself with a final sympathetic look. The door closed. The performance began. For hours, they sat there. Lydia held my hand, while Danny scrolled through his phone, occasionally standing to stretch or look out the window. As afternoon faded to evening, I watched him watching me, calculating, waiting. Finally, Lydia stood. I need coffee, and maybe some air. Can you stay with Dad? Of course, Danny said immediately. Take your time. She kissed my forehead and left. The door clicked shut behind her, and Danny and I were alone. In the room next door, Detective Brooks leaned closer to her screens. Frank received the text alert on his phone and started toward the elevators. The trap was sprung. Danny sat for a moment looking at me. Then he stood and walked to the door, checking the hallway. Satisfied, he returned to his chair and reached into his jacket. When his hand emerged, it was holding a small syringe. Potential weapons spotted, one of the officers said in the surveillance room. Danny turned the syringe over in his hands, studying it. Then he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and looked at my face. You should have died at the bar, he said quietly. That would have been so much cleaner, so much easier. But you had to only take a few sips. You had to be careful. He stood and moved to the IV line hanging beside my bed. This time you won't wake up. Organ failure. Natural complications from the poisoning. Everyone will believe it. Your own doctors will sign the death certificate without question. He brought the syringe close to the IV port, his thumb on the plunger. Lydia will be devastated, of course. But she'll have me. To comfort her. To help her through her grief. And eventually, she'll move on. We all do. He smiled. And I'll have everything. Your company. Your money, your legacy, all of it. The needle touched the port. I wouldn't do that if I were you. My eyes opened fully. Danny froze. What? You're on camera. I said, my voice perfectly clear now. 3 angles. Detective Brooks is watching from the room next door with 2 uniformed officers. It's over Danny. His face went white. The syringe trembled in his hand. The door burst open. Detective Brooks entered with her weapon drawn, 2 officers flanking her. Danny Sullivan, put down the syringe and put your hands where I can see them. For a moment, I thought he might try something stupid. His eyes darted to the window, to the door, back to me. Then the syringe clattered to the floor and he raised his hands. Now you have the right to remain silent. Brooks began approaching with handcuffs. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. This is a setup, Danny said, his voice shaking. This is entrapment. Wanifu. I said, sitting up and pulling the oxygen cannula from my nose. This is justice, The mask he'd worn for 2 years shattered completely. What remained was pure rage, twisted and ugly. "You should be dead," he screamed, lunging toward the bed. The officers grabbed him before he got 2 steps. They forced him to his knees and cuffed his hands behind his back, but he kept screaming, "You were supposed to die." It was perfect. I planned everything. Lydia appeared in the doorway. She must have been waiting just outside. Danny saw her, and his expression changed instantly, rage melting into desperate pleading. "Lydia, please. Baby, I love you. This isn't what it looks like. They're lying. They set me up. You have to believe me. I know what you are," Lydia said, her voice like ice. "I've known for weeks, and I've been helping them catch you." The color drained from his face. "Goodbye, Danny." The officers hauled him to his feet and dragged him toward the door. He fought them every step, screaming threats and curses until his voice faded down the hallway. Then there was silence. Brooks holstered her weapon. That was incredibly brave and incredibly reckless. If he'd moved faster, but he didn't, I said. My phone buzzed on the bedside table. Unknown number. I picked it up and read the text message. "You caught him, but you forgot about me. I have evidence that will destroy you, both photos, recordings, everything. Meet me. Midnight. Port Authority South Entrance. Come alone or I go public with all of it. V." I showed it to Brooks and Lydia. "Vanessa," Lydia whispered. "We never arrested her. She's panicking," Brooks said, reading the message again. "And that makes her dangerous." I looked at the clock. 7:30. We had 4.5 hours. Then we'd better figure out what we're going to do. Detective Brooks studied the text message on my phone, her expression grim. "Without a warrant, I can't officially help you. A threat alone isn't enough for me to mobilize units." "So what do we do?" Lydia asked. "You stay here," I said firmly. "Under protection. Hospital security will keep you safe. Dad, I'm not letting you go alone. You're not. Frank will follow at a distance. And Brooks will have units on standby ready to move the second Vanessa does something actionable." I looked at Brooks. "Right." She nodded. "The moment she produces a weapon or makes a concrete threat, we move in. But Mark, you need to understand. If she's smart enough to stay just on the legal side of the line, my hands are tied." "She won't be smart," I said. "She's panicking, and panicked people make mistakes." I left the hospital at 11, driving my own car to the old Port Authority district on the south side. The area had been abandoned for years, waiting for redevelopment that never came. Empty warehouses lined the waterfront, their windows dark and broken. Frank followed 3 blocks behind in an unmarked sedan. Brooks had 2 patrol units staged 5 minutes out, engines running, waiting for my signal. At 11:50, I pulled into the cracked parking lot of the main warehouse. The building loomed above me, 5 stories of concrete and rust. A single light glowed in a 3rd-floor window. I got out of the car and walked to the entrance. The door was unlocked. Inside the warehouse was a maze of shadows and old equipment. My footsteps echoed on the concrete floor. Then a voice came from somewhere above me, distorted through old speakers. "Hello, Mark." "Vanessa," I said. "Show yourself." "Not yet. First, I want you to know I'm not stupid. I knew you'd bring backup. Frank Murphy is parked 3 blocks east, very predictable." My blood ran cold. She'd been watching. "I've changed the plan," Vanessa continued. "While you were driving here, I made a stop at the hospital. Lydia was there all alone. Such bad timing." A screen flickered to life on the far wall, an old monitor mounted to a support beam. The image showed Lydia tied to a chair, in what looked like another warehouse duct tape across her mouth, fear in her eyes. "What did you do?" I demanded. Vanessa stepped out from behind a stack of crates, keeping her distance. She looked nothing like the polished real estate agent I'd known. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes wild. A woman at the end of her rope. She's somewhere else, with people I paid very well to keep her quiet. What do you want? $20 million, wired to an offshore account, right now. I can't access that kind of money in the middle of the night. Yes, you can. Wire transfer. I know you have the banking app on your phone. I've watched you use it. Do it now, or I make one phone call and those men put a bullet in your daughter's head. My hand went to my pocket, pulling out my phone. The earpiece Frank had given me was nearly invisible, tucked deep in my ear canal. I could hear him breathing on the other end. Keep her talking, Frank's voice whispered. We're tracking the video signal. I opened my phone slowly, pretending to navigate to my banking app. This is going to take a few minutes. The security protocols show. I don't care about your protocols. Transfer the money. I'm trying, but these systems are complicated. Hi, you're stalling, Vanessa said, her voice rising. She reached behind her back and pulled out a gun, small, silver, shaking in her hand. Stop stalling and transfer the money. I raised my hands. Vanessa, think about what you're doing. You pull that trigger, you go from accessory to murder to actual murder. There's no coming back from that. I'm already in too deep. Danny's been arrested. They have evidence I'm going to prison unless I disappear, and I can't disappear without money. Pranik, I said quietly, knowing he could hear me. Any luck? No, found her. His voice crackled in my ear. Lydia's at the South Warehouse, 2 buildings over. Police are moving in now. Stall for 30 more seconds. Vanessa, I said, taking a step forward. I didn't come here without insurance. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that Detective Brooks has been listening to this entire conversation. And right now, her units are surrounding this building. As if on cue, spotlights flooded through the broken windows. The sound of car doors slamming echoed from outside. Brooks's voice came through a megaphone. Vanessa Reed, drop your weapon and come out with your hands up. Vanessa's face went white. The gun wavered. It's over, I said quietly. Danny promised. She whispered. He promised we'd be rich, that we'd be free. He said all we had to do was wait and then it would all be ours. Danny lied to you, just like he lied to everyone. The gun slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor. She sank to her knees, and Brooks's officers swarmed in weapons drawn. They cuffed her gently. She didn't resist, just kept whispering Danny's name over and over. I grabbed Brooks as she passed. My daughter, her radio crackled. Units on scene at South Warehouse. 2 male suspects in custody. Female victim located and secure. No injuries. Okan Brooks said, We've got this. I ran. The South Warehouse was only 2 blocks away, but it felt like miles. By the time I got there, patrol cars had the building surrounded. EMTs were walking Lydia out a blanket around her shoulders, the duct tape gone from her mouth. When she saw me, she broke away from the paramedics and ran. I caught her and held on tight, feeling her shake against me. I'm here, I said. I'm here, you're safe. When I knew you'd find me, she whispered. I knew you would. Over her shoulder, I watched 2 officers lead 2 men out of the warehouse in handcuffs. Andre Williams and Jeff Collins, the names would come later. Vanessa had hired them off some dark web forum, promised them $5,000 each to grab Lydia and keep her quiet for an hour. They were desperate, broke, and stupid. They'd had no idea what they were really part of. But that didn't matter now. All that mattered was that Lydia was safe. Danny was in custody. Vanessa was in custody. And after 3 of the longest weeks of my life, it was finally over. The EMTs worked quickly beneath the harsh sodium lights of the Port Authority warehouse. Their voices were calm and professional as they checked Lydia's vitals. I stood a few steps away, watching my daughter sit on the edge of the ambulance wrapped in a thermal blanket that made her look smaller than she was. Rope marks on wrists and ankles, one of them said while typing on a tablet. Dehydration, mild shock. but she's physically stable. Detective Brooks approached, notepad in hand. Lydia, I know this is difficult, but I need a brief statement tonight. We'll do a full interview tomorrow. Lydia nodded. Her hands trembled, but her voice stayed steady. I left the hospital to go home. Vanessa met me in the parking garage. She said Catherine, my college roommate, had been in an accident and needed me right away. And you went with her? Brooks asked. She was family, Lydia said quietly. I trusted her, Brooks wrote quickly. What happened next? She drove me here instead. 2 men were waiting. They tied me up and kept me in that room. Lydia glanced toward the warehouse. I was scared, but I stayed calm. I kept thinking, Dad will find me. I stepped closer and placed a hand on her shoulder. She leaned into me without a word. That's enough for tonight, Brooks said gently, closing her notebook. Go home. Get some rest. We'll talk tomorrow. Frank Murphy emerged from the shadows, exhaustion etched into his face. It's over, Mark. Both of them are in custody. Danny's being held downtown. Vanessa's at the precinct. The evidence is solid. I shook his hand. Thank you, Frank. For everything. He shook his head. Thank Diana. Her courage set this in motion. The drive home was quiet. Lydia stared out the window at the empty streets as the sky slowly lightened. I feel so stupid, she said at last. You're not. I believed him. I married him. I let Vanessa. She stopped shaking her head. How did I not see it? You knew how to trust, I said. That's not the same as being foolish. I don't know if I can trust anyone again. You will, I said, with time and healing. When we pulled into the driveway, James Cooper sat on the front steps holding 2 cups of coffee. Frank had called him. He stood as we approached, relief written across his face. Thought you might need breakfast, he said. Inside the house felt warm and safe. James moved quietly in the kitchen, making eggs and toast while Lydia and I sat at the table. A short while later, Frank arrived with updates. Danny's being held without bail, he said. Flight risk. Vanessa's cooperating. She'll testify for a reduced sentence. The 2 men who held Lydia will likely take minimal sentences. Lydia looked up. What happens to Danny and Vanessa? Danny's facing at least 25 years, Frank said. Attempted murder, kidnapping, conspiracy. Vanessa will likely get 15, possibly less, with cooperation. Lydia nodded slowly. After Frank and James left, the house grew quiet. Lydia stood in the living room, looking around as if seeing it for the first time. Can I stay here tonight, she asked. I can't go back there yet. This is your home, I said. It always has been. Upstairs, her room remained unchanged. The posters, the books, the quilt Penelope made when Lydia was 10. Will you stay until I fall asleep, she asked softly. Of course. Thank you, Dad, for not giving up. Protecting you isn't a choice, I said. It's who I am. Her breathing slowed as she drifted to sleep. I stayed until I was sure she was resting peacefully. Downstairs, I picked up the framed photo on the mantel, Penelope, Lydia, and me at the beach, laughing. We did it, I whispered. We kept her safe. Outside, the sun rose over the lawn. The nightmare was over. Now came healing. Together, as a family. A month after Port Authority, we stood in a packed courtroom. Danny sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, shoulders slumped, face hollow. The man who'd smiled at me across the dinner table was gone. Judge Robert Harrison read the sentence without emotion. 25 years in state prison. No parole eligibility for 15 years. The gavel struck. As Danny was led away in handcuffs, he looked at Lydia one last time. Her face remained cold as stone. Outside, reporters surrounded us. Justice has been served, I said simply. Now we heal. Lydia stepped forward, her voice steady. To anyone being manipulated, speak up. Trust your instincts. You deserve better. Vanessa's sentencing came that same week. 15 years. As we left the courtroom, she called out, I'm sorry, I was desperate. Lydia didn't respond. By the 3rd month, Lydia had found her footing. I watched from the back of the Mitchell construction boardroom as she presented her proposal. "I'm proposing the Mitchell Family Victim Advocacy Fund," she said confidently. "Programs for survivors of manipulation and abuse. Counseling, legal support, background checks, support groups." The board voted unanimously in favor. After the meeting, I pulled her aside. "Your mother would be so proud." "So am I," Lydia said, smiling. "I feel like myself again." Around the same time, I took Diana Foster to lunch at an upscale restaurant. I slid an envelope across the table, documents establishing the Diana Foster Scholarship Fund. $2 million for children of service workers. Diana's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know what to say." "You keep doing what you do," I told her. "Keep watching, keep being brave." A week later, Diana was promoted to Director of Event Venue Management. She'd earned it. 6 months after the nightmare began, we returned to the waterfront for a charity gala. 500 people filled the ballroom. Lydia stood at the podium in a navy gown, poised and radiant. "6 months ago, I was a victim," she began. "Tonight I'm a survivor. Wealth is measured by integrity, not dollars. If you're being manipulated, speak up. Trust your instincts. Survivors, you're stronger than you think." The applause was thunderous. I felt tears streaming down my face. After the gala, we stood on the rooftop terrace overlooking the city. "I never thought I'd be happy again," Lydia said. "And now I'm thinking about dating again. Someday." She laughed at my expression. "I'll be more careful. I'll trust my instincts." "Do you ever think about them?" she asked. "Well, sometimes," I admitted. "Mostly I think about you, about the life we're building." "Money can be a curse," she said quietly. "Money is a tool," I replied. "It's what we do with it that matters." The next morning, I sat in my office. On my desk were 2 photos, the old one with Penelope and young Lydia at the beach, and the new one from the gala. Lydia and me arm in arm, smiling. People ask if I regret being wealthy. I don't. I regret that it attracted predators, but it gave me the resources to fight back, to protect my daughter, to build something that matters. The lessons are simple: stay vigilant, trust, but verify, love deeply, but stay awake, protect the people who matter. Lydia appeared in the doorway. "Ready for breakfast?" "Where to?" "The corner cafe, where you met Frank." Full circle. We walked out into the California sunshine together, heading toward the cafe where a stranger's courage had changed everything. If you're listening to this story, know this: predators exist, but so do survivors. My daughter survived, thrived, and became stronger. Trust your instincts. Protect your loved ones. Wealth isn't measured by what you have. It's measured by what you're willing to fight for. Evil exists, but so do love, courage, and family. And those things always win. The nightmare was over. The healing continued. This morning, just breakfast. Together. Exactly the way it should be. If you've stayed with me through this entire family story, then you already know what I'm about to say. Sometimes the greatest battles we fight aren't for wealth or power, they're for the people we love. 3 times during this nightmare, I found myself on my knees, praying. The first time was in that storage room at the wedding, hearing Danny plot against my daughter, asking God for clarity. The second was beside Lydia's hospital bed, after the poisoning, begging God for her safety. The third was at dawn after her rescue, thanking God we'd made it through. Each prayer wasn't about dad revenge, it was about protection, wisdom, and strength to do what was right. This family story revealed a hard truth. Money attracts predators, but faith attracts warriors. Don't be like me, don't ignore the warning signs until it's almost too late. I waited, doubted myself, and nearly lost everything. Trust those gut feelings. God speaks through strangers like Diana, through that unease you can't explain, through the instincts He gave you. Real dad revenge isn't about destruction, it's about prevention. It's staying awake when everyone tells you to relax. It's protecting your family before the wolf gets inside your home, not after. Here's my honest take: wealth is a mirror. It shows you who people really are and who you are. The question isn't whether you have money, but whether you have wisdom. Guard your loved ones fiercely. Verify before you trust. Never apologize for being cautious. If this family story touched you, if you've ever felt that warning voice inside, share this dad revenge story with someone who needs it. Drop a comment about your own experience. Hit subscribe for more real stories about courage, protection, and survival, because your story matters too. Thank you for journeying with me to the very end. One final note: upcoming stories contain fictional elements crafted for educational value. If this content doesn't suit you, feel free to explore other videos that might resonate better. But if you're ready for the next chapter, I'll be waiting. Stay vigilant, stay faithful, stay protected.